So it's actually my pleasure today to introduce a colleague of mine. So I've worked with Jerome twice for the same company, weirdly enough. Jerome works at RedShield, and today he's going to be talking about DDoS. How can something so expensive be so cheap? So please join me in a round of applause to welcome Jerome.
Good. So in New Zealand, organisations generally assume that DDoS isn't actually a thing. We're off in our own little corner of the internet, and this sort of thing doesn't really happen here, or does it? So if there's one thing that we learned in 2020 from the DDoS campaigns, it was that this does actually happen. So what we're going to go through today is what is a DDoS attack, what are the common types of DDoS attack, and what can you do to stop them? First up, big shout out to our sponsors for their generosity in enabling us all to be here today. So thanks very much, and also to the AppSec NZ team for putting together this awesome conference. And to RedShield, thanks for giving me the day off and flying me up here. But this talk, while what I'm going to talk about is what I do as a day job, what I'm going to talk about is all kind of general trends that we see at RedShield or publicly available information. I'm not going to talk about the specific stuff that we see hitting our customers. True war stories require beer. So some of you may receive messages like this. It's a bit of a rubbish looking threat, you have to admit. So your initial response is probably to discount it. But some of these threats actually turn out to be the real deal and are actually followed up by attacks. So, for example, I'm sure we've all heard about what happened last year. We saw a sustained DDoS campaign hit a number of New Zealand organisations. Unfortunately for NZX, they became a bit of the poster child for this. And this had some pretty large impacts for NZX themselves, in terms of disruption to their operations, in terms of reputation damage, but also, legal, compliance, financial. There were a number of other organisations that were actually hit at the same time as well. So Stuff, RNZ, those ones made the media. There was a bunch of other smaller ones, and there were probably quite a lot that didn't actually make it into the media. So what we see and what we're aware of is probably just a small tip of the iceberg compared to what's actually going on. And of course, this is happening overseas as well. So AWS in February, they were hit by an attack with 2.4 terabits per second of data. In 2018, GitHub was hit as well. So their normal traffic seems to be about 75 gig per day. They were hit by an attack of 1,300 gigabit per second. Cool thing was they were able to recover quickly and keep their services up. So, not all hope is lost. And indeed, according to Arbor, 95% of attacks are 5 gigabit per second or less, and 75% of attacks are purely volumetric. So these are low skill, low complexity attacks, and there's actually a range of really simple controls that you can put in place that are going to be highly effective against these types of attacks. So what is DDoS? So, well, first up, what is DOS? So a DOS is a denial of a service attack. It's purely focused on disrupting the availability of target systems. It's not concerned about actually hacking in, disclosing information or changing how systems operate. It's just focused on availability. So the way that attackers do this is they find a resource on your system that is limited, and then they try and exhaust it. When that is exhausted, legitimate users can't access your systems anymore, and that is then a denial of service attack. All a DDoS is stepping this up a notch. So instead of having one system attacking you, you've got many, many, many systems being used in the attack. So the attack is distributed across a wide range of systems. The problems with DDoS are, there's numerous problems. One is that it's anonymous. So you don't actually know who's attacking you. It's really hard to do attribution back and find an attacker and go slap them upside the head and tell them stop. It's transient. So there's a couple of different things with this. So attacks just can show up at any time. You don't know when they're going to happen. But also the systems that are being used in attack may legitimately be connecting to you one day, The next, they're used as part of an attack, and then the following day, they're used for legitimate access to your systems again. So it's really hard to ever, put in place easy controls to just block those systems that are attacking you. The attacks are asymmetric, so you have a limited resource, but attackers can use all these flaws in the protocols of the internet to use a whole lot of resources out there on the internet and focus those on disrupting your systems. They're dynamic. So when an attacker sends a DOS at you, they may use one type of attack. As soon as you get a control in place that's effective against that type of attack, they can then iterate and try the next type of attack and the next type and the next type. And so it can be really hard to, A, work out what's going on, and then to figure out an effective control, get it in place, and then react to the next thing. And the final thing is they're lucrative. So as we'll see a bit later, a lot of these attacks cost nothing to perpetrate. They literally cost a few dollars. And the potential payoffs for these attackers are huge. They can get tens of thousands of dollars per attack. Bitcoin has enabled them to directly monetize these via ransom demands. So they only have to have one attack to come off out of 1,000, and they've more than made their money back. So what are the common types of attacks, and how do you stop them? So any internet-connected device has a large attack surface. So we're going to break that down and try and understand that a bit more. So as Sun Tzu said, if you know neither the enemy or yourself, you will succumb in every battle. And that's totally true when it comes to DDoS as well. The first step is understanding what your exposure is to the internet. What are the systems you have out there? And it's not just what you have out there. What do your service providers have out there? Where are you hosting your applications, and what controls do they have in place? So this may sound like the simplest step, but it's actually really hard a lot of the time. A lot of people fail at this first hurdle. So in this diagram, we have on the left-hand side there, we have a web app server, we have a firewall, we have a link to the internet and your public IP. But rarely is your infrastructure going to be so simple. Behind that www, there's going to be databases, message queues, ADCs, all sorts of different components that make up your environment. And then on the right-hand side here, we've got the cloud. Originally, this was dozens of systems, but now this is estimated to be, potentially 5 to 10 billion internet-connected devices. So you don't actually have any idea what is out there on the internet and what these systems are being used for. And as I said, that can change day to day. Another interesting thing is if you have service providers, what are they actually doing for you? What's in your contract? And if something does hit the fan, what are they going to do with your services? Are they just going to drop them? These are all things you need to consider and learn about your environment. So another way to, another way to look at this is, to break it down as the OSI layers. So this is how systems communicate across the internet. So every time you access a web page, you're going to start, the physical layer, electricity on a wire, and you go up through the stack into the application layer where HTTP actually happens. And so you need to understand, in terms of internet-connected devices, it's going to start at layer 3, IP, transport, TCP, UDP, session you can ignore, presentation is encryption, SSL, TLS, and then application layer is HTTP. In terms of an attacker, the costs to do these attacks, start really low. At the lowest level, volumetric attacks are really, really cheap, and they get a bit more expensive as they go up. So you've got to try and put in place controls all through the stack, but at a minimum, you've got to have your lower levels covered before you go up to the higher levels. Oops. For the rest of the talk, we're going to focus on those 4 layers. Should have internet protocol there, but it's yellowed out. So the first category of attack we're going to look at is a reflected attack. So there are 2 main protocols that are used on the internet for communication is, IP, and under IP is TCP and UDP. The first types of attack we're going to look at is based on IP and TCP, IP and UDP. So UDP is like a honey badger. It doesn't care if anyone's listening. It's just going to keep doing what it does. It's going to keep sending data. UDP is connectionless, so it doesn't care if there's a port open at the other end, if there's a service open. It's just going to send, send, send. It doesn't even listen necessarily to what's coming back. So the cool thing about it is it's fast. So this is why it's heavily used on the internet for things like gaming, for streaming video, but also for things like DNS. So there are a lot of these types of services that are out there on the internet that an attacker can potentially leverage off. So, as I said, it's connectionless, so you can just send data, you don't even care if it's being received. So what an attacker can do, so they've taken control of a node out there on the internet, and they're just going to start sending data to you on your public IP. So the aim of this is to flood your network link, make your network link unavailable. So there's 3 problems in this instance for an attacker though. One is they're sending their IP to you. So, you can attribute back this attack. The second one is that they have to have more bandwidth than you, and that may cost money. So, they may not be able to flood you off the network directly. And the third thing is that this is potentially, if you're just exposing web apps, this is the wrong protocol. This is UDP, not TCP. So this may be something you can easily filter out. So to get rid of the first problem, what an attacker can do is what's called a reflected attack. So as I said, UDP is connectionless, and the attacker doesn't actually care about getting any data back. So they're going to find what's called a reflector out on the internet. So a reflector is a system which has a UDP service which is open and will actually respond back. They're going to send packets to that system, but instead of having their IP address in the source of the packets, they're going to have your IP address. When the reflector receives those packets, it's going to see that source IP address and send responses back to that. Instead of going to the attacker, it's going to go to your systems. So this is an easy way for them to hide their IP and make attribution harder. The second problem, and then this is the first example of a DDoS attack. It's distributed. They're using many distributed hosts to actually perpetrate this attack. So they're going to reflect off many, many different hosts, which makes it a lot harder for you to block IPs. Key thing to understand here is this is really simple and it's really cheap. You just have to have an internet connected device, which you have admin rights on, so you can spoof IPs, and that's about it. You can go on the internet, use Shodan, use net scanning to find these reflector servers, and you can just use them for this attack. So it costs nothing. The next problem that the attacker had was, they may have limited bandwidth. They're not able to flood your system off the internet. They can't use all of your resource. They can't exhaust it. So what they can do is called a reflected amplification attack. So again, this is at layer 4. And so as you see up there on the left-hand side, there's a whole bunch of UDP services which are out there on the internet that when you send them a really small packet, you get a really large packet back in response. So say, for example, NTP. NTP has a command that you can send to it called monlist. And what the NTP server is going to do is send you back a list of all the IP addresses that have queried that server. So that's going to be potentially a lot of data. It's an easy way then to amplify the resource that the attacker has and make the attack asymmetric. So, in the first example, they can just find one reflector with this amplification service available, send a packet to it, the responses are going to hit your system and potentially flood you off the network. Or, they can do this in a distributed way. So you're going to get masses and masses of data hitting your external IP and flooding your network. So very quickly, your service is going to become unavailable. So the solution for this is to have upstream scrubbing. So the restricted resource here is your network link. So ahead of your network link, you need to have some sort of tool in place which can just dump all of that malicious data. Because as we said, you're probably only operating on TCP port 80 and 443, so you can just dump all this UDP. So this sort of control needs to be as close to the source as possible. It needs to be capable of handling large attacks. So as we talked about, 95% attacks are 5 gigabit per second or under. So you need to at least be able to get to that level, but hopefully much bigger as well. You want it to be able to filter out all the protocols and ports except those which you need. And you want it to have hopefully low latency and nice dashboards and reporting and that sort of stuff. The next sort of attack, this is a new one. We started to see this a wee while back, and a lot of people didn't actually realize this was possible, but you can actually reflect and amplify off TCP as well. So, potentially a 1 to 14 times amplification. So there's a paper that these people wrote a couple of years back. It's really interesting, have a read. And this basically goes through the whole process of how you run one of these attacks. But at a high level, a TCP handshake, TCP is connection oriented. You actually have to build a handshake with the other server that you want to communicate with. And you do that through a three-way handshake. You send a SYN packet, you get a SYN ACK packet back, you send an ACK packet, there's some parameters in that are set, and you're ready to communicate. So the key thing here is, the server has to know your IP, you have to know the servers, so that you can keep this communication going. But what the attacker can do is, again, they don't actually care about building a connection. All they want to do is generate traffic. So they can send a SYN packet to a reflector that's out there on the internet, and as before, they're going to spoof their source IP to be your IP. What the reflector then is going to do is send the SYN ACK packet back to your IP address instead. But because of weird stuff that happens on the internet, those servers used to, packets getting lost. So, a lot of systems like Linux boxes actually have a setting that if the first SYN ACK packet gets sent and they don't get an ACK packet back, they'll keep sending them. So that's how you amplify data. Another way to do it. And the problem with this for a defender is this is using the correct protocol. It's TCP. It's using the correct ports even. Port 80, port 443. And there are a lot of amplification servers out on the internet. So, you can use any web app server out there, any telnet, SSH, because they're all TCP. So, again, the controls for this are upstream scrubbing, but you have to also be able to do things like GeoIP filtering, and you need to be able to do things like stateful packet inspection. So the next category of attacks, this is direct attacks. So whereas all these other ones that we've already looked at, these are about flooding you off the network by using up all your network bandwidth, these ones are targeted at other layers. I'm going to skip the first one. So probably one of the more interesting ones is called a no crypto attack. So similar to, this happens at presentation layer, when you're building SSL TLS connections. So similar to TCP, when you build a SSL TLS connection, you have to go through a bit of a handshake to set parameters, exchange keys, that sort of thing. So initially, a client will send a client hello. The server sends back a server hello with a certificate and with a key. The next step is for the client to send their key, but then to also create an encrypted secret, which they build using the server key. The server validates that that encrypted secret is valid, was created using their key, and then sends back a server finished message. As we said, the attacker doesn't care about actually building connections. All they're trying to do is utilize resource. So in this case, what the attacker does is they send the client hello, they get the key back from the server, and then they just, instead of creating an encrypted secret, they just cat, dev random, and they just create some garbage data and send that back to the server. So this process over here to actually validate that encrypted secret takes a lot of CPU. So there's a quote, with such a tool and a 2048-bit RSA certificate, a server is using 100 times more processing power than the client. So, you've found an asymmetry there that you can exploit. And they also put a comment, this means that in most solutions except rate limiting, the other controls are just ineffective. So again, the attacker is on the right protocol, TCP, they're using the right ports, it's low bandwidth, and another problem for defenders is that SSL TLS negotiation is often poorly instrumented. So you're not going to have monitoring in place and you're not going to be alerted when these sorts of attacks happen. All you're going to see is your CPU gets pegged to 100% and no one can communicate with your system. So the control in this instance is still your upstream scrubbing has to be able to do things like rate limiting as well. So IP addresses connecting to you, you have to be able to, if they're building lots and lots of new connections, you need to be able to drop those new connections, if they go over a threshold. Another solution is to move the SSL TLS negotiation off to a separate system, which is dedicated to doing that. So it has a lot of CPU or has ASICs, things like that, to speed up and reduce that asymmetry. Don't use 4096-bit keys. 2048-bit keys are considered to be secure enough. And if you use bigger keys, that just makes the asymmetry worse. It takes even more CPU power for the server to validate these kind of connections. So the last one that we're going to look at is called a bot flood attack. And again, this is moving higher up the stack. So it becomes more expensive for the attacker, but these are also a lot harder to filter out. So basically what an attacker does in this case is they have to, because they're building full connections and they're actually doing what looks to be legitimate requests, they need to own a botnet. So, this is going to cost them a bit of money, or they have to go out and build this botnet themselves. So this type of attack, though, is seeking to target not network bandwidth, but CPU, memory, database, something that they can actually try to exhaust by just doing valid-looking requests against your web app. So, say, for example, they're going to find things which are computationally expensive or which are memory or database intensive, like login, like file upload, search, anything that they can find on your system that they can use, which, maybe takes a bit of time to respond. So here, the attacker is just going to send what looks to be a legitimate GET request. So the way that you can detect these sorts of attacks, what's going on here? Is that the bot that's connecting to you is probably just going to be a script. So it's not going to be a full browser. It's not going to be able to process JavaScript. So the first thing is you put a web application. Oh, that's what I was going to talk about in this one. The control here, the control here is to put a web application firewall in path. So, this attack is at the application layer. It's at layer 7. So you need to have an effective layer 7 control to counteract these attacks. So what the WAF can do in this sort of situation is when an attacker sends a GET request, it doesn't then go off to the web server and actually get the page and respond to that. With that, it sends back a piece of JavaScript. And so this is, the first step is, this bot can't process JavaScript. So you've increased the resources that the attacker needs because they have to go off and do things like build a network of, or a botnet of headless Chrome browsers, which can actually process JavaScript. And that takes a lot more memory, takes a lot more CPU, and it's more complex. Once the attacker's gone and built their botnet of headless Chrome browsers, they're then able to actually process JavaScript. So again, you have to try and increase the resource that they need. So the JavaScript you send back is going to have a proof of work function in it. So, whatever you can come up with that takes a lot of CPU, a lot of memory, and then they have to do all that processing, get that proof of work token, and then they send it back in the next request as a header, for example. The web application firewall then can validate that, and if it's legit, they go off to the back end, get the web page, and serve it up to the attacker. And this is a good way of filtering out attackers while still allowing clients to connect. Your end users are going to have a browser. They're not going to be sending lots and lots of requests. They're just going to be sending a small number. So for them, the increase in CPU or memory requirements is not really a big deal. For an attacker, it is. The next one is to ensure that there's actually a human in the loop. So you add a capture. So again, when they send the GET request, the web app firewall, instead of going off to the web server, sends a capture back. They have to have a human, well, hopefully, unless they've come up with something new, they have to have a human there, looking at the traffic lights, looking at the bicycles, and clicking on the squares. So that response then gets sent back to the web application firewall. It validates it, goes off to the web server, and sends the response back. So, general advice. Don't pay. If you pay, they're not going to stop. You have no guarantee that they're going to stop. And in a lot of attacks that we've seen, if one lot of attackers are potentially successful initially, others will jump on the bandwagon. So rather than having to pay one ransom demand, you may have to pay now, 2, 3, 4, 5 ransom demands. If you pay, you've not improved your situation at all. It's much, much better to spend that money on improving your controls that are in place. I can't reiterate that enough. And, if you pay, you're perpetrating this whole cycle. The attackers actually made their money, they've been successful, they're going to continue. What are the other takeaways? The first thing is, this is going to happen. You can go and buy, you don't even have to have the skill to do these attacks. All you need to know is an IP address. and then you can pay a small amount of money and they will do the rest for you. So, there are people out there in the internet that are building botnets that are directly monetizing this, not through ransoms, but actually by getting other people to pay them to do it for them. So, it is highly likely that this will happen, and it's up to you what the impacts are going to be. You need to know your environment. You need to understand where you're exposed. What are all the layers that you have exposed? Where are your systems? What does your infrastructure look like? What are the applications that hosts? Where are they? What are the service providers? There's 100 or more questions that you have to answer to make sure that you can respond effectively. In the event of an incident, who do you call? Are there other people? Do you work with service providers? Do they have capabilities to help you? Can you call NZ Cert? Can you call NCSE? So you have to know the environment that you operate in. Third one is you have to implement effective controls. So, once you know your environment, you know the types of attacks that are going to hit you, make sure that you have controls in place. And like I said, right at the start with the low-hanging fruit. Don't be easy to DOS and work your way up from there. You can't do everything at once, so start with the basics. And validate that they're effective. There will be a lot of you in this room who are responsible for getting pen tests each year. Pen tests, for the most part, they focus on the confidentiality of systems, how they maintain, make sure that data can only be accessed by authorized users, and they also look at integrity controls. How can they stop unauthorized users changing the system or changing the data? But you also have to consider, what testing are you doing against availability? Can you do stress testing of your environments? Do you actually understand how many transactions per second your systems can handle? And have you put controls upstream that actually are configured with that in mind? So if you have rate limiting upstream and it's rate limiting to 10,000 transactions per second, but your web server can only handle 50, you've still got a problem. So you have to make sure that your controls are actually effective, and the best way to do that, as with all security, is testing it. The final thing is exercise your response. So we've talked a lot about technical controls today, but personnel and process are also in the mix. With security, there's that triad between personnel, technical, and process. You have to train your people up on how to use the tools that you have available. You have to make sure that they understand what an attack looks like. Who do they call in the event of an attack? What are the procedures that you can put in place? Can you actually contact the business owner? And in some cases, it may be easier just to turn the system off. It might be the most effective short-term control is just turn it off and find some other system that you can use. And make sure that you've actually practiced these processes. So start with tabletop exercises, get everyone in the room, actually talk through what an attack might look like and what would you do at each step. Who would do what thing and when would they do it? Another key thing is, as a lot of the people, a lot of the organisations that were hit in the DOS campaign found, you have to have effective communications. You don't want to be behind stuff. You want to be ahead of them and have a good message to proactively put out there to make sure that your users are happy that you know what you're doing and you're protecting their information. And again, who can you actually engage externally that can maybe walk you through this process, or that you may want to touch on as you go through it? It might be CERT, it might be NCSE, it might be police. So with this in place, you'll have a much better chance of actually stopping these attacks and disrupting your services and keeping your services available. Hopefully you've learned a few things, so thank you and good luck.
Thank you very much, Jerome, for the talk, and the poignant advice at the end seemed to resonate well with the audience. Do we have any quick questions for Jerome? Okay, so let's thank Jerome again for his wonderful talk.